What's up, guys? Daniel, Joseph, hello to you. Hello there. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Morgan. Nandini, hello to you. Theodore, good morning to you. Well, folks, it is time to begin, and I have a bunch of stuff to talk about today. Rhea, hello to you. Welcome. So, it is Thursday morning, September 10th, 2020. And we are going to today continue talking about the Protestant Reformation, which we've been talking about for the last several days here. Caitlin, hello to you. Welcome. Happy Thursday. And the video that we talked about, or the video that I had up last class, I was having problems with my connection on Tuesday morning. I apologize for that. I kept on trying to stream, and I kept on getting disconnected. I got disconnected 3 different times, and at that point I was just getting frustrated. And so rather than continuing to battle with the internet, I just decided to cut it short. But we are going to make up for a little bit of lost time today, cover a number of different things. Hopefully you did watch that about 25 minutes or so of instruction that I was able to get through the last time on Tuesday. I just want to take a minute to talk a little bit, give you guys a bit of review here, to talk about what are we really talking about here. I just want to summarize it all in a succinct manner, okay? The whole nature of this unit is that all the way up until the Protestant Reformation, you essentially only had one version of Christianity across all of Europe that was completely uniform, and that was Catholicism. And, you know, the Catholic Church was getting engaged in some not so holy practices, some pretty downright corrupt practices, and people, particularly in Northern Europe, started to become increasingly critical of the Church's conduct. And eventually, of course, the major break happens when Martin Luther, for the first time in hundreds of years, broke away and fragmented the uniformity of the Catholic Church in Europe, okay? And what this ends up resulting in, if you'll recall, we talked about how Erasmus, the guy who, if you will, laid the egg that Luther hatched, Erasmus and Luther, we talked about how they kind of had a falling out later on with one another because they became their relationship became very bitter towards the end of their lives, because Erasmus was always of the opinion that, you know, you break away from the church and you're opening up a whole other set of problems, right, that will result in a lot of bloodshed and warfare. And he was absolutely right about that, okay? Erasmus was not wrong, because what we see happen almost immediately after the church breaks away Luther breaks away from the church, is that war starts breaking out. And 2, you also have to remember that it's not just Luther that starts breaking away. Within 10 years, you have other people who are starting to break away from the faith and establish brand new Protestant faiths that are even more radical than Lutheranism, which really wasn't that radical. Remember that Lutheranism, in terms of its similarity to the Catholic Church, Lutheranism is very, very similar to the Catholic Church. Okay, very similar. It's there's a lot of practices that are common between them. They're not identical, but they're very close to one another. And so when we talk about Protestant faiths, of which we're going to see a whole bunch of them end up cropping up, some of these Protestant faiths are more radical Christian faiths, and some of them are more conservative Christian faiths, like closer to the Catholic Church. All right? And so, when we talk about these really radical versions of Protestantism that start to develop during this time, we're talking about Calvinism, the Anabaptists, which I talked about in the last lecture, and stuff like that. These are the more radical ones that even Lutherans are going to be uncomfortable with. So sometimes we see Catholics and Lutherans fighting against one another, like with the Habsburg-Valois Wars, which was really interesting because France is Catholic, but actually ended up siding with the Protestants just to stick it to Charles V because the King of France was bitter that he wasn't Holy Roman Emperor. And so what ends up happening is, I have the hiccups. I've been drinking too much coffee this morning. What ends up happening is that the French actually cross religious lines and join the Protestants in fighting against the Holy Roman Emperor, who was Catholic and really good friends with the Pope during the Habsburg-Valois Wars, right? Which is really interesting. We also see it ultimately result in what became known as the Peace of Augsburg, where basically the Holy Roman Empire gets separated into Protestant faiths and Catholic faiths, Catholic ones being more predominant in the southern regions, Protestant ones being more dominant in the northern ones. But this religious pluralism that we're seeing break out in Europe causes a number of wars to break out between different places in Europe because of the true faith, fighting on behalf of the true faith. Whichever side you were on, of course, you believed yours was the true faith. And so we see permanent religious division in Germany at that point. We also talked about the Anabaptists last time. They're one of those more radical ones where, sometimes we see Catholics and Protestants fighting against one another. Sometimes we see them allying with one another because there were more, like, for example, Lutheranism is a little bit more moderate break from Catholicism. It's not quite so extreme. And so in that case, they kind of join forces to put down the more extreme people like the Anabaptists and stuff like that. All right. We also are going to today talk a little bit more about Calvinism and how Calvinism spreads across Europe. The guy that initiates this change is a guy by the name of Ulrich Zwingli from 1484 to 1531. And he initiated the Swiss Reformation, and he broke away and at first accepted Lutheranism in Switzerland in what amounted to basically a theocracy in Zurich, which is a city in Switzerland. But in contrast to Luther, he saw the Eucharist, which is that breaking of bread and the bread and wine, the ceremony of the Eucharist, the one that actually the Catholics and Lutherans didn't get along with, because remember, the Catholics believed in something called transubstantiation. The Lutherans believed in something called consubstantiation. And Ulrich Zwingli goes even further. He says, I don't even believe in consubstantiation. It's too Catholic. All right, so he breaks away even farther. And this really becomes the first dispute amongst Protestants themselves dealing with issues of church doctrine. And we're only going to see more of that develop as time goes on. There's also the thing called the Colloquy of Marburg that happens in 1529, and this is where Ulrich Zwingli officially split with Luther over the Eucharist issue and kind of breaks even farther away than Lutheranism does down in Switzerland. All right, so that's that. Now, Calvinism is another major aspect of this unit because we have to understand from the get-go, Calvinism is going to be, even though you may not be as familiar with it as you are Lutheranism because of the famous stories of Martin Luther and the 95 Theses and all that sort of stuff, to be honest with you, Calvinism is going to play a lot greater role over time in Europe than Lutheranism does. Lutheranism stays relatively isolated to Scandinavia, Denmark in some places, and then northern Germany. Calvinism spreads to England, to Scotland, to France, to the Dutch Republic, to Switzerland, to various other places. And even in America, we see that the English Puritans who left England as a product of religious persecution ended up setting up colonies in Massachusetts Bay and in Plymouth Bay. And then too, basically all of New England becomes very, very Protestant, very puritanical, okay, very Calvinist. Because when we talk about Calvinism, you got to understand Calvinism takes root in kind of different forms depending on where we're talking about. So, for example, you have the French Calvinists, known as Huguenots, okay? You have the Dutch Calvinists. They're known as being part of the Dutch Reformed Church. You have the Scottish Calvinists. They become known as Presbyterians. You have the English Calvinists. They become known as Puritans. But at the end of the day, the root of Calvinism remains the same between them all. But Calvinism, kind of like the Anabaptists, it goes a lot farther in terms of its break. So of the Protestant faiths, Calvinism is going to be a much more radical version of Christianity, okay? It's going to be far more radical. It's going to be way less tolerable to Catholics. It's going to be less tolerable to members of the Church of England. It's going to be less tolerable to Lutherans because it's seen as a really extremist Protestant faith. And indeed, the Calvinists live a very strict Christian lifestyle, okay? It's certainly not a whole lot of fun to be a Calvinist, okay? There's a lot of really strict rules. The rules of the Calvinist faith are indoctrinated into the laws of the places that they take over. For example, when John Calvin gets exiled to Switzerland due to his really radical reform ideas, he starts practicing his faith in Switzerland and establishes essentially a theocracy. And just to let you know what a theocracy is like if your pope and your president were the same person and that all of the laws of the land were based on the faith. And we even have some theocratic governments that exist today in the modern world. There's a couple in the Middle East, for example, and so on. The Shah of Iran would be an example of a theocracy. Okay, or not the Shah, the Ayatollah of Iran. Okay, and so that's a theocratic government where the faith and the civic government doctrine are virtually of the same thing, and you have the same leader for the faith as you do as your regular government. All right, so that's what a theocracy is. Institutes of the Christian Religion is the most famous work that Calvin made, and it was the foundational work for Calvinism. Some of the things that it talks about in the Institutes of the Christian Religion are the idea of predestination. See, the thing with Calvinists is that they believe that God was all-knowing, that God knew everything. That means that if God knows everything, he knows past, he knows present, and he knows future. If he already knows who's going to heaven and hell, all right, that means that before you're even born, God has made a determination or has knowledge of whether or not you're going to reach salvation. And so this is a rather grim outlook because, the Calvinists more or less believe that of all people, of all Christians, only about 10%, maybe even less, actually make it into heaven because they're living too sinful of a lifestyle. And so, you might think that this would turn people away from Calvinism. Well, for some, perhaps it does. But for people who are truly God-fearing, for people who are truly worried about going to hell, okay, they view Calvinism as essentially your only opportunity. Even though the chances are grim, you kind of have to look at it from the opposite perspective and say, for the people who are truly fearful, for the people, and remember, we're still living in a pre-scientific revolution time, the vast majority of people in Europe still believe that the Earth is in the center of the universe and that it's this perfect immovable sphere and all other celestial bodies revolve around the Earth, which of course is not accurate. But you have to understand the context in which they are living is one that is still superstitious, mystical, very much heavy beliefs in divine intervention in day-to-day daily activities. If there were plagues, famines, wars, fires, whatever, natural disasters, it was very much viewed as not from a scientific perspective, but rather from a religious one, that God was punishing people and so on. So they're living in a very different historical context. And these people are truly God-fearing. And so they think to themselves, if I'm not living in the faith of Calvinism, which is the strictest and most radical of these Protestant faiths, I have a good chance of going to hell. So I better darn well stick with the Calvinist faith. Now, the Calvinists believed in this idea of good works only insofar as you're doing the good works because of your living a Christian lifestyle, not doing good works the way the Catholic Church said, which was that the good works are a requirement to go to heaven. It's not that they didn't think you needed to do good works. The Calvinists, along with the Lutherans, both believed that you needed to do good works, but that doing good works alone, just to be recognized for doing good works so that your priest tells you you're going to heaven, isn't the right reason to be doing good works. That you should be doing it as a product of living a Christian life, that you should be doing it as a product of having love for God in your heart, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Okay, so good works are a sign that one may have been chosen for salvation. And the way that God revealed if somebody had been chosen for salvation in the Calvinist faith, because there were some people who were known as visible saints, okay? These were people who had a very clear conversion experience, probably some sort of dramatic, emotional, religious experience that would then be reviewed by the higher-up members of the Calvinist faith, who were known as the elect. The elect would take into consider these visible saints, these visible conversion experiences, and determine if you were one of these model Christians. And if you were, there was an even greater expectation after receiving this designation of being a visible saint or a member of the elect, that you become a model Christian and that you live a very strict Calvinist lifestyle, which means, frankly, you know, a very what's the word? Conservative lifestyle. You know, certainly no drinking, no dancing, no singing, particularly singing secular songs, in other words, non-religious songs, and those kinds of things. So Calvin ends up establishing his own theocracy in Geneva, which is a different city in Switzerland, by the year 1540. And Geneva really became the center of the new center of the Reformation in Europe, because the original center of the Reformation was in Saxony. It was where Martin Luther broke away. But by 1540, the center has kind of changed now to Geneva, and Geneva became home to Protestant exiles from England, Scotland, France, who were exiled from their respective kingdoms, and then went to live in Geneva with John Calvin. And later ended up adopting the Calvinist faith and bringing their ideas back to these various other places, England, Scotland, France, the Dutch Republic, and so on. Like Zwingli in Zurich, Calvin believed that the church and city should combine to enforce Christian behavior. The idea that there should not be a separation between church and state, but instead that all of your state laws should be based purely upon the religious faith. And indeed, there's been a lot of examples of this, particularly with the Puritans who came over with the same idea. They were trying to establish these English, culturally English, but religiously Puritan, meaning Calvinist, settlements in the New World. And so, the people that came over that were reverends in the Calvinist faith, like the Reverend John Robinson, I think his name was, and a number of others, came over and created places in North America, particularly Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Colony, settled by the Pilgrims, who were even more radical Puritans than the regular Puritans were. Okay, they came over and they tried to create these religious holy experiments where they tried to establish places that were religiously uniform in the Catholic faith, that also made laws based on the Calvinist faith, based on the Calvinist faith, right? They're trying to make laws that uphold God's moral law and the scripture in the Calvinist Bible. So like Zwingli in Zurich, Calvin believed that they should not have a separation of church and state, that the state should be trying to enforce Christian behavior, and only those who committed to following Calvinism were allowed to live in the city of Geneva at that time. The other thing to remember about Calvinism is it's also the most militant and uncompromising of all of the Protestant sects, meaning that, for example, they had something called the consistory, which was a judiciary made up of lay elders, in other words, people who had the title of presbyters, and they had this power to impose very harsh penalties for people who did not follow God's law. So if you were caught doing things like drinking, singing, dancing, lending money at more than 5%, gambling, any of these things that were considered downright gluttonous, impulsive and sinful behaviors, people were punished harshly for this, sometimes even executed for it. There was also this guy, Michael Servetus, who was a Unitarian humanist from Spain, and he was burned at the stake in 1553 for his denial of the Holy Trinity. So the Calvinists took their faith very, very, very seriously, and they expected absolute conformity, absolute uniformity. The Calvinists were known for being extremely low on religious toleration. They did not tolerate people of other faiths living in their communities, and they tried their best to keep their uniform faith intact. There was also something that inspired the Protestants, known as the Calvinists, known as Protestant work ethic. So Calvinists adopted this idea of this importance of hard work, of a good work ethic. And they started to take on this idea, which is a little bit ironic, actually. It's a little bit counterintuitive, because the Calvinists were meant to live simple lives. They were supposed to reject materialism. Calvinists were supposed to reject greed. They were supposed to reject making a name for themselves and living this individualistic lifestyle. Okay, but oddly, they take on this thing called the Protestant work ethic, which states that when you're working hard and if you're making money and you have this accompanying financial success, it was a sign that God was pleased with you, that God was rewarding you for your good work, which is, of course, a very self-reinforcing idea. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's the idea that, like, well, God is on our side no matter what. So if we do bad, God is going to punish us. But if we're doing well, if we're working hard and we get rewarded for that, and we happen to make a little money on the way, that means that God is rewarding us and God is in our favor. Okay, so it's kind of a little bit of undermining some of the original tenets of Calvinism, which was to reject individuality, which was to reject, the glam and the glitz of the Catholic Church, which got known for commissioning super expensive artwork and having these huge cathedrals that were super ornate and expensive to build, and having beautiful stained glass and stuff. Calvinist churches were supposed to be really plain, really simple structures, typically made out of like wood and stuff like that. They didn't have these grandiose cathedrals. They were supposed to be simple worshipers and rejecting wealth and stuff. Okay, but Protestant work ethic actually, ironically, ends up making a lot of Calvinists, particularly the Puritans who settle in North America, in the New England colonies, very wealthy in a relatively short amount of time. Okay, Calvinism spreads far greater than others into future generations than Lutheranism does. As I said, Lutheranism remains pretty isolated to Scandinavia and northern Germany, but Calvinism spreads everywhere. So, like I said, Presbyterianism was established in Scotland by a guy named John Knox, who was a Scottish Calvinist in 1560. And presbyters were the ones who governed the church there, and that became ultimately the dominant religion in Scotland. Also, you had the Dutch Reformed Church. Really quickly about this, there was something called the United Provinces of the Netherlands. All right, here's the deal about the Netherlands and all of that region that we refer to as the Low Countries. The Low Countries are Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. They are, despite their name, they're not called the Low Countries because they're south. They're called the Low Countries because of their elevation. They have a very low sea level, but they're located just to the northeast of France. They border France. They're situated right between France and Germany. All right, and so the Dutch, those areas originally, even though they were culturally different from the Spanish, they were originally controlled by Spain. So those Low Countries were very important to the Spanish rulers. And the thing that's important to remember about that is because they were culturally different, and because the Dutch had some of the most profitable ports in anywhere in northern Europe, like with Amsterdam, and then they also had Antwerp in Belgium, modern-day Belgium. These are very important ports that the Spanish were using by this point to bring in a bunch of wealth from the New World, and they didn't want to lose control of them. But ultimately, the Dutch end up breaking away from the Spanish and fighting a war against Spain for their independence. And in 1581, this is kind of what we start as known as the Dutch Golden Age, where the Dutch break away. They establish their independence, known as the Dutch Republic, but it doesn't get officially recognized by all the rest of the European powers until all the way up until 1648. So these are contested areas. Also, it's only the Dutch that break away. The Spanish are able to retain control over Belgium. And that becomes known as the Spanish Netherlands for a period of time there, until eventually even Belgium breaks away and establishes their independence down the line a while later. So, but the Dutch end up embracing the Calvinist faith, and they take on what becomes known as the Dutch Reformed Church, which was in the Netherlands in northern Europe, where modern-day Amsterdam is. Calvinism, spread of Calvinism goes to France as well with the Huguenots. The Huguenots were French Calvinists who were brutally suppressed in France because France had a Catholic king, believed in Catholic uniformity, and they believed that, that the Huguenots were essentially heretics. The thing that made the Huguenots hard to suppress in France is that the Huguenots were especially strong among the nobility, which means that the people who were converting to Calvinism were relatively high-ranking figures in society. If it had been a bunch of lesser nobles, or if it had been a bunch of peasants or something, they probably would have been able to contain the spread of Calvinism of the Huguenots in France a lot more easily. But because it appeals to the nobility class, France fights a number of different wars within France against Calvinists. But it is important to note that there were Calvinist converts in every social class. And then finally, you have the Puritans in England, and they pressured Elizabeth I for more reforms. But Elizabeth I, who we're going to be talking about a little bit later in today's lecture, ended up being very adept at navigating the murky waters of the religious pluralism that was happening in Europe between the Anglicans, which I know we haven't talked about, but we're going to talk about today. The Anglicans are the Church of England, okay, and the Calvinists, who, again, there were a number of Protestants who. A number of nobles who started converting to Calvinism in the English court. And this meant that Elizabeth I had to be very careful about, playing both sides and retaining her power and not allowing for religious wars to break out in Europe. And she does this rather successfully, despite the fact that she is actually a female ruler and was viewed by a lot of these male nobles as being a little bit inferior in terms of just based on the fact that she's a woman and not a man. And the Puritans ultimately, of course, because the English start and go settle in Massachusetts and Connecticut areas, as well as other regions along the eastern coast of what is now the modern United States, they later established colonies in America in a region that became known as New England, where the Puritan faith spread to America and indeed played a major role in the development of American history. So the Puritans have a far more widespread, Calvinism has, in general, much more widespread impact on Western history than, say, Lutheranism does, even though the Lutherans were the first ones to break away from the church. Ultimately, in England, by the time that we get to the mid-1600s, there is a civil war that breaks out. By this point, Queen Elizabeth has been long dead, and the Puritans end up victorious in the English Civil War, and a lot of people in Parliament, the high nobles of England, ended up being in power. The Puritans of the nobility in England end up being the ones that are victorious in the English Civil War. Countries where Calvinism did not spread would be Ireland, Spain, and Italy, because they're all the most heavily Catholic nations in Europe. Okay, reasons the Reformation does not spread to Italy. How come we don't see the Protestant Reformation go to Italy? Well, number one, of course, remember the center of the Roman Catholic Church is in Rome. The Pope is situated in Rome. That's going to mean that, basically, if you've got this major hierarchy of the church there, it's going to make it a lot more difficult for Protestantism to break out in Rome. But there were other reasons too. For example, the church was a major source of wealth for Italy from all over Europe. And so they didn't want to undermine the Catholic Church in the Italian states, particularly the papal states, though, because they made a whole lot of money collecting church taxes from people across the realm. Italian Renaissance also made Italy very prosperous, so it was working for them. Remember, the church was commissioning a lot of those artists to make great religious art from the Renaissance masters like Michelangelo and stuff. And then finally, Germany had more liberal universities than Italy did. Italy had a number of very conservative Catholic universities where ideas of the Protestant faith were less likely to spread around than they were in Germany, where they had a little bit more liberty to be able to talk about controversial ideas surrounding faith. Okay, English Reformation. We need to talk a little bit about the English Reformation at this point. The last time we really started talking about England was when we were talking about the War of the Roses, and I'll kind of recap some of that. But the thing that makes European history a little bit difficult to understand is we're really not talking about a single history. We're really talking about multiple histories of multiple different peoples and places. And so, England, we kind of, in this class, we have to jump around. We've jumped from England to France to Switzerland to Saxony, the Holy Roman Empire. We talked about, the Italian states. We're kind of jumping all over the place here, but today we're going to do some time to go back and pick up the story where we left off in England and kind of give you an idea of what happens there. A couple of early English reformers, we talked about John Wycliffe and his followers, Lollards. And Lollardy, as it's sometimes called, still existed in certain regions of England by the 16th century. So Lollardy sticks around for a while, John Wycliffe's followers. So there had been people who may not have formally broken away from the church, but they were certainly questioning of the Catholic Church and stuff. And then you had William Tyndale, who was a humanist, and he translated the Bible into English in 1526, which was really controversial because the Bible was only allowed to be read in Latin or Greek translations. And so Tyndale ends up getting hunted down and executed in 1536 after thousands of English Bibles had made their way to England, and this was considered a sin. And so Tyndale had also refused to recognize Henry VIII's leadership of the Anglican Church. We haven't told that story yet, but it's coming up in just a few minutes here. And so, but Tyndale's Bible ultimately became the basis for what became known as the King James Version, which is an English version of the Bible that emerged under King James I somewhere between 1603 and 1625. Okay, so at this point, we kind of have to talk about Henry VIII, all right? And the last time that we talked about Henry VIII, or actually the last time that we talked about England, we hadn't even gotten to Henry VIII before. And so right now, I'm going to kind of switch gears. I'm actually going to put the camera back on my ugly mug, and then we can proceed here. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Henry VIII, because this story is going to take me the majority of the remainder of class here to cover, and we need to make sure that we kind of understand this story. And I just told this story to first period, but I'm going to tell you guys it's an interesting story. I think you'll find it rather entertaining. But rather than going on the PowerPoints, even though the PowerPoints have maybe a little bit more specific information here or there about the things that you may want to know about this, as well as the questions on the reading guide that you've been doing and so on, I kind of want to tell the story a little bit more from just a storytelling perspective rather than muddling it down with a bunch of details. You can kind of go back and fill in the details to the overarching story, but I just want to make sure you understand the narrative of what happens here. All right, so let's take you back a little bit. The last time that we talked about England, we talked about this conflict known as the War of the Roses. And at this time in England, there was essentially a civil war going on between the two houses of what was known as the Plantagenet dynasty, the Yorks and the Lancasters. Okay, and the Yorks and the Lancasters had this dynastical dispute about who was the rightful king of England, and they had this long, protracted conflict known as the War of the Roses, where English folks are fighting against other English folks and so on. And the last thing that I really told you about that was that there was this battle where Richard III, and I told you the story about how Richard III killed his own nephew so that he could become king. Richard III battles in this battle in 1485. So just to set the time straight with other things that we've been talking about in the class, remember, Martin Luther doesn't break away from the church until 1517. So this is a good 32 years or so before the actual breakaway from the church. And so we're still living in a holy Catholic Europe. Okay, holy not as in H-O-L-Y, but holy as in not partly, but holy. Okay. Catholic Europe, including England, all right? England's very Catholic at this time. And the victor of that battle is not Richard III. Remember, Richard III was slain in that battle, and he was the last king of the Plantagenet dynasty. And after he dies, the guy that won the battle was Henry Tudor, and he establishes a brand new dynasty in England known as the Tudor dynasty, Now, I mentioned to you in Unit 1 that Henry Tudor was very significant because he went a long distance to centralizing the authority of the English king, right? He did a lot of centralizing of the English state, and he was doing everything that he could in his power to legitimize his reign. Remember, he's a brand new monarch. He's from a brand new dynasty. And because he's from a brand new dynasty, it's going to create a situation where people are going to be challenging his rule. People are going to be looking for every excuse they can to question the legitimacy of his reign. And so his first order of business, the very first priority that he makes, is legitimizing his reign and subduing any discontent to put a period at the end of the sentence of the War of the Roses and not have any more conflict happen while it's on his watch now as king. He also did some other things we talked about, like establishing the Court of Star Chamber, which was like this inner circle of the king that was able to hold kind of these tribunals behind closed doors and stuff like that. He does some other things. He marries the older sister of those two nephews that I told you of that were killed by Richard III. He marries the older sister of those guys, you know, and now this is years later. She's of marriable age. It's not like she's a kid or something like that. She was their older sister anyway, so she was already probably of marriable age by the time that those two boys were murdered, who were about 10 and 13 or so. And so, you know, they get married. And the reason he does that is not by accident. He chooses her because now any kids that he produces, and remember, the number one priority of any king is to have sons so that your dynasty can continue on into the future. He marries her because now his sons are going to have the blood of the previous dynasty, right? This legitimizes his reign. It makes people more palatable to his reign because now he's mixed his bloodline with the previous king's reign. It legitimizes people's understanding of like, okay, the kids that come out of this marriage are going to be the rightful heirs to the throne. We may not love Henry Tudor, but at least he's making good decisions and stuff like that. He also does some other things to legitimize his reign. I won't get in all, bog you down with all the details of it, but he is really, really, really interested in making sure that no one is going to come up, rise up, cause him problems, rebel. He wants to make sure that all of that is taken care of very early on, and he does a very good job of doing that. So he gets married to Elizabeth of York, okay, this older sister, and ultimately ends up producing two sons, which for a king is a good thing because you want to have a couple of sons, maybe three sons, you know, to make sure, because it wasn't a guarantee that everybody lived until adulthood those days. It wasn't even a guarantee that you made it out of childhood in those days. So you wanted to have at least a couple of sons as backups, if you will, in the event that your eldest son died. Okay, and so he gives birth, or well, he doesn't, but Elizabeth of York gives birth to two boys. The first son that he has, he names Arthur. And he does this again as another way of legitimizing his reign. Everybody in England knew the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. It was a story that was hundreds and hundreds of years old, and people knew the story. It resonated with the English people. And again, this is something that he thinks is going to set really well with the English people, because it's kind of like, you know, drawing upon English history and honoring the English tradition and the English culture and stuff like that. And so he names his eldest born son Arthur. And then he has a second son, and he names his younger son after himself, Henry, okay? So you now have Henry VII, you have his two sons, Arthur, and the younger son, Henry the Younger, okay? So what happens? The next major step that Henry Tudor, Henry VII, makes in legitimizing his reign is he takes a look at European politics of the time. And he says, you know what, we were at war with the French for about 100 years. Okay, the French are a threat to English existence. Okay, they could cause us problems in the future. Meanwhile, the French and the Spanish had some qualms and competition with one another. Also, meanwhile, the Spanish have by this point already sent Christopher Columbus, you know, Queen Isabella of Castile, and King Ferdinand of Aragon, who married and consolidated the Spanish kingdom. All right, they've already sent Columbus over to the New World. So Spain now has colonies that they're establishing over in the New World, and they're bringing back a bunch of wealth from the New World, particularly silver. All right, and they're bringing back wealth. King Henry takes a look around at kind of some of these developments politically that are going on in Europe at this time, and he says, you know what, maybe the enemy of my enemy can become my friend. So he says, take a look at France. They're a threat. We hate the French. Okay. Take a look at Spain. They're kind of a rising star. They're offering a lot of promise about the discovery of the New World and all of these other things to Europeans, at least. And they've established these colonies, and they're becoming wealthy. Maybe we can forge an alliance with the Spanish. And the way that he goes about doing this is that it just so happens that right about the same time that his baby boy Arthur, his eldest son, was born, okay, Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon have a brand new baby girl. Okay, and one of the things that rulers used to do in this time was something called betrothals. Betrothals. You betroth your child. And what this means is that you essentially make an arranged marriage for your kid. Now, it's not a guarantee that others will accept it, but being the fact that this prince, Arthur, was going to be the future king of England, this is a pretty promising figure, okay, to betroth. And being that the king and queen of Spain have this baby girl, what betrothals frequently result in is alliances between kingdoms. So again, the reason that Henry's doing this is not just because, maybe this is, maybe they'll grow up and be happy with one another and fall in love. It has nothing to do with that. He could care less whether or not they fall in love. He wants them to get married so that England can secure an alliance with Spain, which at the time is a pretty powerful kingdom, and have kind of a mutual interest in subduing the interests of France, as being the fact that England and Spain are both really strong Catholic nations, and both of them view France as a political threat and an economic one. Okay, so they betroth. He betroths his son, Prince Arthur, to the daughter of the king and queen of Spain, and her name is Catherine of Aragon. Okay, Catherine of Aragon. And Catherine of Aragon, from the time that she is an infant, it is known that one day she is going to be the Queen of England. She's going to marry Arthur. When Henry Tudor dies, Arthur will become king, and they'll live out happily ever after as King and Queen of England. All right, well, that was the plan, at least. There's another reason that Henry VII wants his son, Arthur, to be married to the Catholic princess of Spain, and that is because in these days, when women got married to men, there was a procedure, there was a ritual known as a dowry that went along with the daughter to the husband's family. Why would the daughter give a gift to the husband's family? Shouldn't it be the husband that's paying the gift to the daughter? Well, that does happen in some cultures, but in English culture and in European culture, the vast majority of the time, the dowry was provided by the female family, and the reason for that is because it was this kind of like it's kind of like a gift to say, look, our daughter is no longer a part of our family. She's a part of your family now, and she's going to be your responsibility from here on out. And so here's what we have to offer with our daughter, and this is going to be the last gift you ever get from us. Okay, so it's really kind of resigning the daughter away from their own family's responsibility over to the husband's family's responsibility. The reason, though, that Henry Tudor's particularly interested in a dowry from Spain is because Spain's bringing back all the silver from the New World. And so what ultimately he's really looking at, he can't wait for Catherine of Aragon to come of age. Not because he cares about her. He doesn't care at all about her. He cares about the fact that she's going to bring a boatload of wealth with her that he's going to be able to use to continue to consolidate his reign in England, legitimize his rule, and to make England wealthier in the process. Okay, so when she arrives, she takes a boat up to England. She arrives at about age 14, which was at that time marriable age. 14, 15 is about the time that betrothed couples got married. Okay, and so she comes up. She's 14, 15. She doesn't speak a lick of English. She's got a boat full of all sorts of gold, jewelry, silver, nice clothes, etc., that the king and queen of Spain have sent with their daughter, securing this alliance between England and Spain. And, the boat arrives, she walks off the boat. He's like, get out of the way, move. I want all the wealth on that boat put into my personal chambers immediately. He doesn't really say that, I'm just exaggerating. But the point is to say he could have cared less about Catherine of Aragon. She's just like, a function of a greater scheme to increase the wealth and prestige of his dynasty. Okay, and so anyhow, she has about 2 weeks or so to get to know, okay, as much as you can get to know someone in 2 weeks, I guess, to get to know her to-be husband, Prince Arthur. And when she first meets him, he's so charming, he's so charismatic, he's really likable, all right, he's attractive, he's kind of a Renaissance prince, he sets a good example, he's pious, he's well-versed in poetry and various other things, he's a likable guy, he's seemingly a pretty good fit for a prince, but she doesn't speak a word of English, so they have to communicate with one another in Latin of all things, because that's the only language that both of them knew that they could communicate with one another. And then after about 2 weeks of getting to know one another, then they hold this marriage ceremony, and the expectation that things move pretty quickly here in these days, right? Get married and immediately make the marriage official, if you will, consummate the marriage, have physical relations with one another so that once again you can procure an heir, okay? So the expectation when Catherine of Aragon, the princess from Spain, and Prince Arthur, who's still prince at this time because he's still, only an adolescent. Henry VII is still alive at this time. He's still the king. They get married, and they're presented together for the first time, as was custom in basically all European cultures at this time. When the prince got married, or when the king got married, or whatever, they presented the couple in the royal bed for the first time for all the courtiers to encourage them now to engage in the procreation of an heir, right? They go and they excuse them, they're dismissed to their chambers, and they have their first night together as husband and wife, okay? And the expectation, as I said, is you kind of make things official. And what ends up happening is that things don't go quite according to plan. And so Catherine of Aragon, when you're a princess, when you're a high royal figure, you have all sorts of courtiers, servants, maids, butlers, people like that serving you. They help you get dressed, they help feed you, they have all sorts of ceremonies regarding royalty, okay? The next morning, after her wedding night, her first night with her husband, Prince Arthur, she's talking to some of these closest confidants who came with her from Spain. They speak Spanish and or Castilian, and she's able to communicate with them. She also has a priest that came with her from Spain. And in all of her closest confidential relationships that she had with people, from the very get-go, she swears up and down that something just isn't right. It seems that once the doors are closed and they're together with one another, she can't tell, is he shy? Is there something going on? Does he not find her pretty enough? She just doesn't understand it, but ultimately she swears up and down that the marriage never really is consummated, that her marriage is never made official through an act of love, to put it kindly. Okay, so this of course is concerning to her. She doesn't get pregnant. And people are kind of like, they've been married for a few months now. She's not showing with child. What's going on here? Well, as it turns out, and unfortunately for history, this is just how things go sometimes, unfortunately for, I guess, Henry Tudor is really who I'm saying, there wasn't going to be an heir, okay? There wasn't going to be an heir, and it's not because there was anything wrong with Catherine of Aragon. She was fine, and really, frankly, there's really nothing wrong with Prince Arthur either, except for the fact that he's just not that interested in girls in particular, okay? And so, being that the case, they don't engage in any sort of a relationship with one another on a physical level, but Catherine of Aragon can't figure it out. She doesn't understand what's going on. She's just a girl, she's only 15 or so, probably at the same age as you kids. And so she can't really quite figure it out. And then something worse happens, which is that Prince Arthur gets sick. Okay, he gets ill with, I believe it was tuberculosis. And tuberculosis, super deadly, obviously. It's very contagious too. And he dies. Okay, and so he dies within about a year or so of them getting married. And so they're not married a very long time. And now she's 15 or so, maybe barely 16, and she's already a widow. Okay, so she's 16. She had this whole life set up ahead of her where she was promised to be the Queen of England and all this stuff, and it's just crumbling before her eyes, right? And she's kind of freaking out because once she has lost her husband, once that marriage has dissolved as a product of him dying prematurely, she's now kind of viewed by everyone there as damaged goods. Okay, she's no longer useful. Henry Tudor has no interest in sending her back with her dowry. Okay, so she's kind of floating around like a ghost in the English court, like kind of, she came with all these beautiful clothes and stuff. Her clothes, by the time that, a few years pass, her clothes are tattered. She's not getting anything from Henry. Henry Tudor, again, could have cared less about Catherine of Aragon. To him, she's just like she's a nuisance, okay? She filled her purpose, which was she brought all that dowry money over, and that's all he cared about her for. The alliance with Spain, well, maybe it will happen, maybe it won't happen, but at this point there's not too much concern about that because England's doing pretty well. So, but Catherine of Aragon, of course, is very concerned, and she's kind of thinking to herself, how am I going to stay relevant? Okay, how am I going to transition this scenario into something that I can make something of, so that I just don't fade away into obscurity? And so she has one other opportunity in her mind, and if you were starting to predict this happening already, good on you. She realizes, there is another Prince of England, and so there was a younger brother, right? Remember that Prince Arthur was the older one. He's now dead. She's now a widow, but there is one more prince that has an opportunity of being married to, and that is Prince Henry. So Prince Henry, though, the problem being that it was uncommon for men to marry women who were older than them. And the reason for that is because, there's a few problems. We'll talk about them. But one of the reasons that a lot of times royal figures in particular didn't want to marry women who were older than them is because women are unable to continue producing children all the way through adulthood. They go through menopause in the late 30s or whatever, and they stop producing kids. So effectively, if you're marrying an older woman, you're reducing the number of times, the amount of time rather, that you can have children. Okay. And potentially produce heirs to carry on your dynasty. So you're marrying with a bit of an age disadvantage there in terms of the amount of time that you have to produce children or proper heirs. But nonetheless, the other problem is that he's like 6 years younger than her. So whereas she's already 15, okay, and she's an adolescent and she's already a widow. She's got to wait 6 years because Henry VIII is only about 9, okay, to catch up to a proper marriageable age. And so she's got to find a way to stay relevant, not die, because remember, disease and other things like that were still a problem, okay, and manage to kind of not fade away for 6 whole years so that Henry VIII Prince Henry can become old enough to get married to. By that point, she'll be 21, 22, and again, not an ideal situation. It's an upward battle, okay? This is an uphill battle. It's going to be tough for her to be able to manifest this goal of hers to ultimately still marry. Done the reading assignment, forgot to submit it. Just send it to me. Send it to me on Canvas, and I'll take care of it, okay? Just send it to me on Canvas, and it'll be fine. All right, So what happens next is we got to wait for Henry to become of age. And so Henry gets older. He turns about 14. By about 14, she's been around. She's been around the English court. He knows her, obviously. He's known her since she got married to his older brother. But, he's starting to come of marriageable age, and he's looking at his prospects a little bit, and she's still an attractive prospect because of the Spanish side of things. If they can secure an alliance with Spain, this will mean good things potentially for England in the future. Yeah, that'll be fine. Not a problem at all. That's fine. Okay. So anyhow, so she's still a reasonable option, but there are another couple of problems here, and it has to do with religious problems. Okay. Now, remember that at this time, by the time that we're getting into early 1500s, 1510, 1515, we're getting closer and closer and closer to the Protestant Reformation breaking out. And there's starting to be a little bit more questions about religious upheaval and stuff like that, particularly in Saxony in the Holy Roman Empire. But Henry VIII, when he turns 15, he is a young, handsome, fit, poetic, musically talented, pious. He's very religious. He's a Renaissance prince. He's a classic Renaissance prince. He's at the height. He's living at the height of the Renaissance, okay? He's good at hunting. He's good at writing. He's well-read, okay? He is really a good option for a Renaissance husband, okay, or a marriageable husband, all right? Now, by this point, Catherine of Aragon's about 21, 22, all right? So she's a little older than he is, but nonetheless develops, in some sense, kind of a more natural connection with Henry VIII than even she did. Remember, she only had 2 weeks to meet his older brother. She probably didn't really know or connect that well with his older brother, but by the time that she's been around England, she's been learning the language. She knows Henry. She's known him for some time, and she's had an ability to kind of play her cards right for a period of time, get to know him, get him to trust her, okay, things like that. And so, he ends up, they say, falling in love with her, and they do get married. But there's some problems with it, because in the Bible, it says that you're not allowed to do two things. Number one, you're never allowed to lay with the wife of your husband, okay? You're not allowed to engage in physical relations with the wife of, with the wife of your brother, okay? With the wife of your brother. Okay, that was considered like a really bad sin. You cannot lay with the wife of your brother. And then the other one was you cannot marry your brother's widow. So there's two rules that he's essentially going to be breaking here, okay, that he's really concerned about, because again, we're living in a superstitious, mystical time. People believe in God punishing people for sinful acts and stuff, just as right as they do the rain. And so, the process for doing this is going to be kind of tricky. He doesn't want to marry Catherine of Aragon unless it is approved by the Pope. And in order to get a marriage like this, where there are some kind of basic principles that you're kind of breaking, you needed to get what was known as a dispensation from the Pope. So Prince Henry and Henry VII, King Henry VII, his father, kind of come together. They write a letter to the Pope saying, "Look, here's the situation," and then Catherine of Aragon swears up and down this whole time that their marriage was never consummated and thus never made official in the eyes of God. Okay, and she's such a pious woman, I tend to believe that that's probably what happened. Okay, so she probably never did become physical with Prince Arthur, even though they were married for a handful of months. She certainly never got pregnant during that time or anything like that. So there seems to be reasonable evidence to conclude, in addition to how much her faith was important to her, that she probably was telling the truth. And taking these things into consideration, the Pope writes back to Henry and says, "Hey, I've prayed on it, God has communed with me, and it's been determined by the Roman Catholic Church that this is going to be a sanctioned marriage. You have the green light. You can go ahead and get married and not worry about it," okay? So Henry's overjoyed. Thank goodness, we can finally make this alliance with Spain happen. I know Catherine of Aragon well. She's been living around the court for a number of years now. I have a true affinity for her. So he's pretty overjoyed that they're able to get married. But remember, he is young. Okay, and she is not as young as he is, and so they consummate the marriage. Henry and his new wife, Catherine of Aragon, get pregnant. Actually, they get pregnant a number of times. But the problem was that just as a product, probably as a result of stress, to be honest with you, because Catherine of Aragon lived in such a precarious position with English courts for so long, and as a product of maybe biology, some women just have a more difficult time carrying children and stuff like that, just on a product of their physical health. Anyhow, she ends up having a number of miscarriages, all right? And things are starting to look kind of concerning, because the more that you have, the less likely a future pregnancy is going to be successful, and people are kind of concerned about this. There's been a couple of close calls with her in terms of her health situation, and so she's not the healthiest of women, but ultimately she does get pregnant, and finally the pregnancy goes full term. And Henry is overjoyed. He can't wait because he's been waiting an awful long time to be able to have a son to continue the dynasty of the Tudor dynasty and secure a little bit more insurance on the viability of the Tudor dynasty. And so she gets pregnant. She goes full term. He's ready and waiting to hold a brand new baby boy in his hands. And she gives birth to a brand new, beautiful, healthy baby girl. And when this happens, Henry VIII is fuming, okay? He looks at this as God punishing him for having gotten a dispensation for a marriage that from the get-go he knew was a sinful act of matrimony, that he wasn't supposed to marry her, and that now God is punishing him by both having a bunch of miscarriages, but then also now by having a daughter. Of course, we know these days there are very reasonable medical and biological explanations for why these things happen, but they're living in a pre-scientific revolution time. They don't know any of this stuff at that point. So the explanation that God was punishing him was a very rational one in his mind. Meanwhile, there's another situation developing, a situation with a woman by the name of Anne Boleyn, who came from the French court, was very flirtatious. The French court was known for being a little bit more, scandalous here and there, okay? And the English court was not. The English court was very prim and proper, very conservative, right? And so she kind of comes up from having lived in the French court for a while. She's now hanging around the English court. She starts seducing Henry VIII. And boy, oh boy, especially after he has a daughter. And by the way, his daughter with Catherine of Aragon was, by the way, her name was Mary. And by that point now, a number of years have passed. And Catherine of Aragon is no longer in her early 20s. She's in her mid-30s. She's getting closer and closer to that age where having children becomes more and more of a health risk. And in light of the previous problems that she had, it doesn't look good. And so she starts to very much kind of get distanced. At first, the king moves her to like the other side of the palace. Then he moves her to an entirely different palace altogether. Then he moves her to an even farther away palace, and he just kind of systematically moves her farther and farther away. She's living in a tiny little swamp, basically, in the middle of Wales by the time that later events happen. But basically, he just moves her further and further away. And it's a really sad story because Catherine of Aragon truly loved Henry VIII. And so, she gets moved away. She brings her daughter with her. So Mary is raised by her mother, which means that she's raised very strongly Catholic, just in the Spanish tradition. And so, he never really makes a strong bond with Mary. Mary and her father, Henry, were never close with one another. And so, and it's sad, because she ends up dying. They say that Catherine of Aragon ultimately ended up dying of a broken heart. And she would write letters to Henry, please, I would forgive you for everything if we just go back to the way things were and we continue living and so on and so forth. It's really sad. But Henry VIII already has a new love object in mind, and her name is Anne Boleyn. And of course, she is playing the most powerful chord that she knows is going to strike the strings of Henry VIII's heart, and that is, your marriage was sinful, and if you were married to me, I would provide you a son. And that's all that is music to Henry's ears. That is all he needs to hear in order to pursue this new plot to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn and make her the rightful queen of England. But something's happened. Henry, by this point, got into a hunting accident. And unlike when he was 15 to 20 years old, by the time that he starts entering into his mid-20s and into his 30s, he got injured in this hunting accident, and he has this open, festering, gaping wound on his leg that just will not heal. And it's painful, and it makes him immobile, and instead of going out and getting exercise and going on hunting expeditions and doing other things, he increasingly becomes more and more slovenly. He becomes really grotesquely obese. He's eating constantly, okay? He grows to be several hundred pounds in weight. He is huge. Okay, it was said that 3 full-grown male courtiers could fit safely inside the king's robe. Okay, he was just this gargantuan human being, and as he got older, he got more grotesque and more disgusting. And remember, people didn't bathe very much in this time, and he just got to be very loathsome. Okay, and also grumpier, because what happens when people have long-term injuries like that, especially ones that are super painful, it wears on your mental fortitude. It makes you angry, it makes you frustrated, and you just become less, nice. You become, in Henry's case, more tyrannical. And as Henry got older, and as his time as king proceeds, he gets more and more and more tyrannical, and also more and more God-fearing in a way. All right, because he's convinced that he's done this sinful act and God is punishing him. Now, he writes to the Pope because, again, he already had to get special permission just to get the marriage with Catherine of Aragon off the ground. Okay, so he writes to the Pope, and he basically says, look, I understand that back in the olden days, however many years ago, 12, 20 years ago, somewhere in that region, you dispensed of these scripture passages and allowed me to marry Catherine of Aragon. Alas, I believe God has been smiting me for engaging in a sinful act, and I would like to have this marriage annulled. He wants to get an annulment through the Catholic Church, a divorce, if you will. All right? And by this point, the Protestant Reformation has already broken out. So we're now in the mid-1520s. Chaos is reigning because people are freaking out that the Lutherans have broken away from the church. Previously, Martin Luther had condemned the Lutherans as being sacrilegious, and remember Henry grew up in a very Catholic England and was very Catholic himself, and devoted to his faith and stuff. And the Pope writes back to Henry and he goes, "Look, Henry, I'm going to level with you. All right, we dispensed of this. We dispensed of these trivialities earlier so that you could get married and have children. And we're really sorry to hear that that hasn't worked out. But in case you didn't hear, there's kind of this whole thing called the Protestant Reformation going on right now, and we kind of need to hold up some degree of integrity in the church and not just do whatever kings ask us to do. Back in the olden days, pre-Protestant Reformation, we could have helped you out. That wouldn't have been a problem back in those days. But now people are criticizing the moral sanctity of the church. We have a reputation to uphold here, buddy. We can't just be handing out divorces to people." So Henry gets the word. It's this whole long to-do. Meanwhile, he's trying to get closer and closer to Anne Boleyn. She's not going to engage. She's not going to let him lay one finger on her until there's a ring on her finger, okay? And so she's, playing this whole game. She's got him wrapped around her little finger. She keeps on talking about how she's going to have a son for him, but he has to get a divorce and make her Queen of England and stuff. He's trying his darndest, but it takes a long, long time. Things like this did not move quickly back in those days. So after about a decade of trying to secure a divorce, this poor Catherine of Aragon's moving farther and farther and farther away from Henry, he's trying to get this divorce secured through the church, and it's just not happening. And he hires this cardinal in England named Cardinal Wolsey, okay, to go down and talk to the Pope personally. And the Pope says, "Look, if you want to get this settled, we'll have we can have a meeting. I'll grant you an audience. I'll grant Henry VIII an audience. But I got to tell you, I am not making any promises." The Pope makes it clear to Wolsey, okay, that they're not going to get a divorce, that it's just not going to happen. And Wolsey knows that he's going to have to go back and give this bad news to the king, and it is stressing him out. On the morning that Wolsey is supposed to go and consult with the king, okay, he's on his way to meet with the king. It's probably 8 or 9 in the morning. He's so stressed out because he knows delivering bad news to King Henry at this point in his life is not going to be good for Wolsey, because it's probably mean that his head is going to be unceremoniously removed from his shoulders. Okay? He has a heart attack on the way to go talk to the king, drops dead on the sidewalk, essentially, before he has a chance to tell the king, the Pope's not going to grant you a divorce. Okay? Probably from just being so stressed out about the fact that he was going to die anyway. So the point is to say that then the King Henry VIII says, you know what, we're going to hire a new guy, Thomas Cranmer. And Thomas Cranmer says, look, we need to just give up on the Pope. There's only one way to go about this solution. People across Europe have been criticizing the Pope. People have been breaking away from the Catholic faith because the Pope has demonstrated to be corrupt. And indeed, if there was any one such evidence that the Pope was corrupt, it was the fact that he sanctified a sinful marriage between you and Catherine of Aragon in the first place that never should have taken place. And the wheels now start turning in Henry's head. And he starts realizing that the easiest way to get a divorce here from Catherine of Aragon is simply to pull a Martin Luther, break away from the Holy Roman Catholic Church, okay, and establish a brand new Church of England, which he would be the head of. So between this plot that starts to develop between Thomas Cranmer and Henry VIII, they eventually decide the best way to go about this is to establish a brand new church called the Church of England. And they break away from the Catholic Church. And now Henry, being the head of both, in what was known as the Act of Supremacy, being the head of both the church and the state, can do basically whatever he wants up in little old England. And so, of course, the very first thing that he does is divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. Now, by that point, Anne Boleyn was already probably pregnant. And so, because this had been going on for a long time, and it was pretty clear that Henry was going to make this move, so they engaged in this. And she is pregnant. They get married. And about 7 months or so after they get married, she gives birth. She goes full term. Henry is over the moon. Finally, the world is going to be set right again. Okay? She goes full term. He's ecstatic. On the day she goes into labor, he cannot wait to hold a son in his arms at last. And she gives birth to a brand new, beautiful, healthy baby girl named Elizabeth. And immediately Henry leaves the room, doesn't even hold her, just walks out of the room. He's furious. He can't believe that once again he's been conned into thinking that somebody would provide him a son. And of course, we know that biology, it's actually his fault. But the point is to say that he believes that once again, now he's worried that he's being punished for breaking away from the church entirely. So Henry is so stressed out about this entire situation, and he feels like that he's been lied to. Remember that for years, Anne Boleyn had been promising him a son, and finally, her act of giving birth results in the birth of a daughter, and he is just over it. He's over it. And she has no more cards to play. The last card that she had up her sleeve was providing a son. She didn't, and it is done, okay? And Henry immediately turns on her, and he fabricates a plot where he basically implicates Anne Boleyn of having extramarital affairs with other courtier members, which she probably didn't do, but nonetheless tries her for treason. She is found guilty and is beheaded. So he beheads Anne Boleyn for giving birth to a daughter, essentially. All right. And two, he's looking for a new way to secure a son. So the third wife that he has is a woman by the name of Jane Seymour. And Jane Seymour is not exactly not exactly ringing Henry's bells. He's not head over heels for Jane Seymour the way that he used to be for Anne Boleyn, but he's pretty grumpy and he's pretty cantankerous and pretty upset. And at this point, all he cares about is his son. And so he gets married to Jane Seymour, and she does get pregnant. She does go full term, and she does give birth to a son by the name of Edward. So he names his son Edward. But she dies in childbirth. And so, once again, it just seems like, nothing's ever right. And so he gets married 2 more times, once to a woman who he was promised was beautiful, but ended up being not so beautiful. So he divorces her inside of about a month, and then sends her back to wherever she came from. And then he marries his 5th wife. By the time that he marries his 5th wife, he is a truly disgusting human being, okay? He's morbidly obese. He's still got this festering wound that won't heal. He's grumpy. He's tyrannical. He's broken away from the church. He's angry, and he's not exactly Mr. Universe or something. Okay, so she comes over. She's young. She's attractive. She's even younger, believe it or not, than his daughter, his eldest daughter, is by this point. Okay, so there's a huge age gap as well, and it's just not good. Okay, the whole thing is ill-fated. And she, being young and attractive, is attracted to other young gentlemanly figures within the court. She does actually engage in a number of affairs. She gets found out. She's beheaded. That was his 5th wife. And then he gets married to his sixth wife, and that's the one that ends up outliving him. And all of these women are in the PowerPoint, but I'm kind of running low on time here, so I'm trying to wrap this story up. The idea being here, though, that when Henry dies, his son, Edward, takes over because he's male. Even though he was the youngest of the three children that he had, the male always takes first priority. And so he was the only son that he had, and therefore the oldest son that he had, and that was the son that took over. But Edward the Sixth, Henry VIII's son, not a very healthy child from the get-go, constantly struggled. I think he had like asthma or something like that. He gets sick, and he dies after only ruling England for about 6 years. However, during those 6 years, and for the vast majority of Henry VIII's reign, England had already broken away from the church. And so Edward the Sixth ends up continuing the same Anglican Protestant values. Keep in mind, the Church of England, very similar to Lutheranism, is one of those faiths that barely breaks away from Catholicism. It's kind of like when you go to a grocery store and you see like that the grocery store clearly used to be a Vaughn's, and you can even still see like the outline of where the V was on the building, but they've taken the V off and put a J on there, and now it's John's Grocery Store. Okay, like it's almost identical. They're hard to even tell apart, the Catholic Church and the Church of England, but in name and in practice they are different. And so anyhow, Edward VI continues the practices of the Anglican Church, but he dies, and he's only like, I don't know, 19, 20, maybe 21 when he dies, so he doesn't live a very long time. He doesn't leave behind any heirs either. And so now the question is, who's it going to go to? Well, the only person who was a legitimate heir or claimant to the throne was his eldest half-sister, Mary, the original daughter that Henry had with Catherine of Aragon. And so Mary, though, is Catholic. Remember, she was raised by her mother, and her mother never agreed with Henry breaking away from the church, and neither did Mary. And so Mary, when she becomes queen, tries to basically take the cat that has long escaped from the bag and stuff the cat back in the bag, okay? Try and turn England Catholic again. And the way that she goes about doing this is going to all of her father's most loyal advisors, most loyal Anglican nobles, and executing them. Okay, so she starts this plot to basically re-Catholicize England, to bring the Catholic faith back. And look at her name is Mary, same as the mother of Jesus, right, in the Christian story. She's thinking to herself, she was destined by God to make England Catholic and stamp out this heresy of the Anglican Church. But it's really going to be very hard to do that. And the way that she goes about doing it is in an extremely brutal fashion by basically just beheading a bunch of people, which is why she becomes known as Bloody Mary. Bloody Mary, the name of Mary I, Queen of England, who tried to take a Church of England, the Protestant Anglican English, and re-Catholicize it. All right, and she's only queen for a short time, because what ultimately ends up happening is that she keeps on thinking that she has immaculate conception. She thinks that God is impregnating her. She was married. This was all the other part of her plan, was to forge this alliance with Spain, which she was finally able to do. She marries the King of Spain, but they don't live together. The King of Spain lives down in Spain. She lives in England. But she keeps on thinking that she's getting pregnant by way of immaculate conception, like God impregnating her or something. But it turns out she wasn't. She died rather rapidly and unexpectedly. Her health declined very quickly. And what was really happening was that they did an autopsy on her, and they realized that she had a massive, massive stomach tumor, which had likely metastasized and went to her brain. She was acting very, very, very weird in the last few months of her life because she was ill with cancer. And so when she dies, that's when the reign then goes to the new Queen of England and the last of the Tudor dynasty, and that's going to be Queen Elizabeth I, who we talked about a little bit earlier in today's class. But alas, I am now out of time. So that brings us to the end of today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed it today. This was a good lecture. Lots of good storytelling in this one. And I will be posting the assignment on Canvas just as soon as I am able. and make sure to get that done. And I will see you guys. It is Thursday, so I will not see you guys back here again until Monday. But please do have a wonderful weekend. If you have any questions about today's story, don't be afraid to like and subscribe, or make sure that you send me a message on Canvas. I'm just joking around with you. So have a great day, folks, and a great weekend. We'll talk to you again soon. Make good decisions.